systems are really built to habituate. They're built to get used to stuff, right? Chocolate cake looks really good when you're hungry and you just had a light dinner and it's just what you wanted. And then the second piece comes and you're like, oh, okay. And then the third and the fourth, and by the sixth piece, you're like disgusted. Like it's awful, right? That's your dopamine, reward system. It understands when things are good and when you don't need it anymore, and when it's actually, presenting a possible harm to you. Oxytocin circuits in the brain don't have that same sort of time frame. In fact, the way that they get formed early in life has an influence on your whole potential throughout life to make relationship and to function in connection with other people. There isn't evidence that oxytocin habituates in the same way. It's like the more you can engage in behaviors that involve oxytocin, the more steady and strong it is in supporting those kinds of behaviors in your life.
That reminds me of a study I saw not that long ago in which they compared amateur singers and professional singers, and they're measuring their oxytocin before and after a singing lesson. And singing for the amateur singers greatly raised their oxytocin levels. So singing for the average person appears to be an oxytocin elicitor that we often don't think about. I think part of the reason for that is that evolution assumes that if there's music around, it's made by other people and you are with other people. And evolution didn't know it would be packaged into an iPod Nano that would be stuck in their shirt. But for the professional singers, their baseline oxytocin before singing was actually much higher even than the amateur singers after singing. So the professional singers had a very high baseline oxytocin that then went up enormously after singing. So there may even be benefits in terms of oxytocin tone from singing more. That maybe all of us could use more singing, because we're also a relatively singing deprived culture. There's another interesting thing about our culture is that the conception of music is that it's a solo expert activity that's performed by people with lots of training, and you shouldn't attempt this at home or you'll be very embarrassed. But that's not how music is conceived in lots of other cultures. It's very likely not how it was conceived in our evolutionary past, where pretty much everyone sang together, so it doesn't really matter whether you have a great voice or not. It's a community activity. So I wonder if we're not only touch deprived, but maybe also musically deprived, or at least singing deprived.
Yeah, certainly singing together deprived. We get the occasional happy birthday as a group. Sometimes nicer than others. So we kind of began to meander into this area of suggesting that love, that touch, that singing together are good. But can we focus on that a little bit? In what ways does having love in your life afford benefits to a person?
Sure, and one of the consistent benefits appears to be some substantial health benefits. So there's lots of medical research looking at social isolation as a risk factor for illness and social connectedness as a protective factor for illnesses across many, many different illnesses. There was a gigantic meta-analysis in 2010 that I'm sure you're familiar with too, that demonstrated that social connectedness had a greater effect on mortality than your blood pressure, than your weight, than whether you smoked cigarettes or not. And so for physicians, this is just staggering, because we're used to think of cigarettes as the single most important thing that could affect anyone's mortality. So this is a factor that is more important to your mortality than cigarettes. And yet it's very rare to go to the doctor and they ask you about your relationships, or how are they, or how could they be better. It just doesn't happen. So that hasn't appeared to permeate down to the operational level in medicine, although the research is emerging about physical health benefits, and you've written some about that.
Yeah, that's right. One of the other things that I do at the Greater Good is co-instruct a massive open online course, so a MOOC, called The Science of Happiness. And because we're researchers, in addition to people who like to teach, we asked a bunch of questions of our students, and this time we've taught it. We're right in the middle of our fourth launch of the course, but in the third launch, which was last fall, we also asked people to tell us about a friend who would give us their opinion about the students. And so we asked people, how often do you see this person? What's the quality of your relationship? And then think about the last few weeks that you've been around them, or your past few times you've interacted, and tell us, have they seemed cheerful? Have they seemed, sort of disinterested? Have they seemed angry or irritable? We asked about 16 different sort of feelings. And at the same time, we asked the students themselves to tell us how they're feeling, and in terms of happiness, in terms of stress, in terms of loneliness, a lot of these issues. And what we found when we looked at the relationship between the peer, so this is the friend saying, this is how our relationship is, either good, really good, or exceptional, and the person's own ratings of their happiness, their stress, their loneliness, there was a stepwise improvement that was systematically related to the peer's judgment of the quality of their relationship. So the people who had a friend who said, yes, our relationship is exceptional, we're doing the best across all of our measures, they were the happiest, they were the least lonely, they were the least stressed, they were flourishing at the highest levels. So that was just one little fun piece of data from today, people all over the world that just told us how important it is to be in at least one relationship with somebody else who would look at that relationship and look at you as an extraordinary or exceptional friend. Really, really helpful to people.
Now, given that, would you say that it's possible for someone to attain a significant level of happiness without relationship? Is relationship necessary or sufficient, or both?
I think it would be very hard for someone to look at their own lives and consider themselves happy. And you're actually, and I mean that's a little bit anecdotal. Let me give you the researcher answer. One of the earliest studies of happiness, which looked at a lot of people again and asked them to indicate how happy they were, and then looked at what was going on in their lives, found that the one factor that just systematically predicted whether a person was in that bucket of very happy, like I am very happy, was their sense of social connection. So it seems just pervasively important. It seems to be necessary. It's not necessarily sufficient. You can't only have social connection and have nothing else and land into that very happy group. But there were no people who were in that very happy group that didn't have really strong social connections.
And that's interesting, because I also have reached the same conclusion clinically. Not from conducting research, but just from seeing people in their ordinary lives. It's always perplexing to me, because culturally, lots of people, including young people, think that in order to have a relationship, they should be capable of feeling happy and self-sufficient alone, then they are ready for a relationship. And so lots of people have the idea, if I can't be happy alone, I'm not ready for a relationship. It doesn't make any sense to me, because happy people inevitably are in relationships. People are not designed to be alone, fundamentally, and so it seems to me, well, no wonder you're not happy. That's right. So you shouldn't practice aloneness and perfect it, and then think that is going to allow you to have a relationship, although that is a pervasive cultural idea, which is pernicious and seems to me utterly without merit.
You're echoing a theory called the social baseline theory, which is recent, and it emerges from a culmination of many neuroscience studies that try to understand what happens in the brain when people are in company versus alone. And what they always did was almost exactly what you said. They put the person into a scanner alone, and they looked at what their brain did. And then they put them in a scanner in a way that made them feel like they were in company with somebody else. And then they subtracted the alone from the with somebody else, because the alone is like the baseline. That's the natural state, being alone, and the being with somebody else. We should see what happens in the brain. And they just kept not finding stuff. Right? They kept not saying extra activation that turned on when people were in company. And we thought, like, what the heck? Right? There aren't special areas that come on that make it easier or that have to help us get along or connect with others. Actually, being alone is the condition. Being in company, that the idea is that our baseline is to be social, that we expect, our nervous systems expect to be in company of others. We consider other people a, what do they, quote unquote, bio-behavioral resource. So another person is there and is a resource for us, and without other people, we feel anxiety, we feel stress, we have to utilize our nervous system in a different way, which ends up, in the long term, being harmful to our health. We get hyperinflammation. We have cardiovascular problems. So
Definitely, and I think neuroscience, at least from what I've seen in of the medical sciences, is leading the way, or is far out ahead in terms of taking this idea seriously and actually adopting experimentally in studies the fundamental idea that people have a normal mode of operation, which is to be in continuous communication with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that scientific studies that don't have that as the baseline may simply not tell us much, because it'd be like taking a fish out of water or something like that. It doesn't tell you a lot about how it's supposed to function.
Yeah, I think you're right. Developmentally, there's evidence that if you, so there's another way of thinking about relationships and how they influence